Welcome to Insider Events Equipping Generations to Make a Sustainable Future Possible, in partnership with Schneider Electric. Here's our host, Senior Sustainability Reporter and Insider, Catherine Boudreau.
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine Boudreau, Insider Sustainability Reporter. Thank you so much for joining. Time and again, we've seen how world leaders fail to take aggressive enough action on climate change. Lately, there's been some positive developments. The European Union agreed to reduce its natural gas use in order to protect itself from Russian supply cuts. Also, Senate Democrats agreed to a budget deal that includes hundreds of billions of dollars in clean energy tax credits. But climate politics are always uncertain, and in light of that, companies are being asked to step up to help solve the crisis. Companies are making new climate promises every day, from net zero to carbon neutral to carbon negative. But it's very challenging to hold them accountable to those promises and understand whether it's enough to keep global warming in check. And we're already feeling the consequences of global warming. A deadly heat wave hit the entire northern hemisphere, and wildfires have lit up California, Portugal, and Spain once again. These natural disasters cost lives and economies. Part of the problem is there's no one global standard for how to tackle this. For instance, what investments are considered green? Or is it okay for companies to purchase carbon offsets instead of reducing greenhouse gas emissions of their own? And how do we track progress? Essentially, it can feel like the Wild West out there. We'd love the audience to join the conversation on social media by using the hashtag InsiderEvents. You can also submit questions for our panelists through the dashboard at the bottom of the screen. And you'll see an icon for our survey that you can take at any time during or after the event. We'd really love your feedback. And now, to give us insight into how companies are tackling these challenges and equipping future generations to do the same, I'm joined by three executives from Schneider Electric, IBM, and Citi. One of the main levers that Schneider and IBM have is the industrial and computer software that they sell to other businesses, while Citi, as one of the world's largest banks, can shift the way it finances and invests in companies. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. Vanessa Miller-Fels is Schneider Electric's Vice President of Global Environment and Climate. Christina Shim is Head of Strategy and Sustainability at IBM Sustainability Software. And Val Smith is Chief Sustainability Officer at Citi. Welcome. So I think I'd like to start with Vanessa. And can you just briefly explain how your company both contributes to the climate crisis, but also some of the tools you have to address it? And then we'll let the other panelists weigh in too.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for inviting me. First, it's a pleasure to be here, and I really like the title of the panel, which is really about empowering people to really think about the solutions. So Schneider purpose is really about that. It's to make the most of our energy and resources, bridging progress and sustainability for all. And Schneider has had sustainability goals. They started their journey like in 2004, so quite early. But obviously, as we see the climate crisis kind of becoming more and more acute, we've increased our sustainability commitment. And we now have robust sustainability commitments as a company, including becoming carbon neutral in our operations by 2025, reduce our absolute emissions across all scopes, so scope 1, 2, and 3, so inclusive of a value chain, by a quarter by 2030, and to be net zero across a value chain by 2050. And this will require working with a whole ecosystem, obviously our suppliers, but also our customers for us, because we sell solutions to electrify and decarbonize the world, but at the end of the day, they consume electricity. So our downstream emissions are in fact quite significant at Schneider. And so we're really in the business of sustainability. But so what are the tools that we have? Well, we're a leader in digital transformation of energy management and automation. So a lot of our solutions are digital energy automation, smart kind of automation solutions. And it's particularly key, as you pointed out, right now to think about that as energy landscape is going through major shifts. This winter, Europe will lose likely about a third of its supply. We have two levers. It's either more supply, and where does it come from? Or it's less demand. And we really play across both spectrum. We help bring more supply on the grid by electrifying the grid and helping, connect wind turbines or whatever new supply we can bring on the grid. Unfortunately, these are more like, they will result in electricity in a year or 2 years from now. And then we can play on demand, which is really what we have to do like right now. We have to be more flexible on demand. And we already see in Europe, the grid operators, the utilities asking the end customer to change their behavior on how they're consuming energy, particularly for this coming winter in Europe.
Gotcha. Okay, so it sounds like you're about reducing energy and making sure it's deployed at the right time. Christina, I want to shift to you. Can you tell us a little bit about IBM? How you both contribute to the climate crisis, but also what are you guys deploying to help solve it?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So, IBM is really committed to making sure that we internally are also creating sustainable operations for ourselves through our own commitments. We similarly have a net zero commitment by 2030, as well as many other commitments that we can go into further detail around impact writ large, not just from an environmental perspective, but also from a social and governance perspective. Um, in my role as the head of strategy and sustainability for our sustainability software business, we are committed to creating software solutions that are supporting our clients enable and accelerate towards operationalizing their sustainability goals. So oftentimes a lot of different companies and organizations and executives and governments are coming up with these different commitments that they are promising that they will support and start accelerating towards, but they're oftentimes not really sure how to go about doing that. And so that action and that operationalization is where we are really dedicated in focusing our tools and our software from infrastructure, real estate, ESG reporting through supply chain, and making sure that we are supporting our customers and clients to enable them to achieve their goals particularly through their core business operations. So that's where we are focusing most of our attention, and we feel really proud about the fact that we can support all of our customers in a way where, taking it from their actions, taking it from their commitments and from their goals and imperatives down into their business and really operationalizing towards finishing and getting towards those goals is where we are dedicating our efforts.
Okay. I'd love, Val, for you to weigh into about Citi's role.
I think you're going to hear a common theme here when we think about Citi's net zero commitment, about how many different connections we have to climate change. We definitely also think about a value chain perspective. So for Citi, we have a net zero operations commitment for our global operations by 2030 and a net zero emissions associated with our financing commitment by 2050. And it's the financing piece that I think really taps into the tools and the ways that Citi is engaging directly with our clients to help to bring about their decarbonization, which helps them to transition to net zero, helps us to transition to net zero. So specifically, what we've been doing since we announced our net zero commitment just over a year ago in March of 2021 is developing the measurement, employing the methodologies to understand the emissions associated with our clients, particularly clients in carbon-intensive sectors, understand how to attribute those emissions to Citi, and then the most important piece, once we have that understanding of a client's carbon profile, how do we engage with them? How do we advise them? How do we finance them so that they can decarbonize? That's really the journey that we're on at Citi.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So I would love to know, if you guys can put in perspective what the work that you're doing impacts, everyday people, or at least would raise their awareness about like more sustainable choices. For instance, Vanessa, I think Schneider Electric, some of their your biggest customers are maybe in the real estate sector or manufacturing. And those are your big customers, but what about potentially homeowners, for example, just trying to help our audience visualize the impact?
Great question. So we're in the business of making electricity sustainable, and everyone consumes electricity. Or unfortunately, 1 billion do not have access to electricity on Earth today. But we all, thrive if we have access to electricity. And so homeowners are a good example. Homes represent about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And my home or your home alone is like a drop in the ocean. But our homes combined is a quarter of worldwide emissions. So as a consequence, like if we can really decarbonize like every home and make every home net zero, then we really have a big contributor to climate change that we can kind of address. And the awareness that homes are part of the solution really is starting to emerge. Like we just conducted a survey, and it showed like 45% of homeowners would like to make their home more sustainable and think that it would save them money. And more than 50% would like their homes to become net zero. So using, exactly the words we're using as a corporate and climate science kind of lingo. So there's two kind of type of roles that the digital solutions that we're developing can play to help so homes become more sustainable. First, we can make sure that the homes are intelligent, that they adapt the energy consumption to its actual need. Where are you in home? What's the weather outside? Is there a window? It's as simple as that. Is there a window open? Smart plugs, smart blinds, smart thermostats, smart meters. But then it's also about educating the consumer, going back to the demand lever and empowering the consumer, really. It's really about empowerment. And I think we all talked about that. We're all at this moment where we are trying to make sure that everyone on Earth, like whether it's a corporation or individual, can measure their carbon footprint. And on the electricity sector, it mattered to even go to a real-time carbon footprint measurement because the carbon content of the electricity varies like really 15 minutes per 15 minutes. And so this is really the tools we've developed. We've developed a tool that's called Wiser, that's a smart home solution that enables the end consumer to really understand their consumption real time, see the energy usage, see what usually is invisible. We usually don't think about the power in our homes and really identify the hidden cost. And what's really amazing is when energy becomes smarter, there's always energy efficiency that comes with it. There's always emissions reduction that are possible. Up to 40% really on average. So it's really like where we want to start with home, even with small and simple steps. Homeowners can easily save up energy in an efficient manner and contribute to our climate change goals.
Thanks, Vanessa. And Christina, just speaking of tracking progress and having the right data and intelligence, I feel like that's a good segue to you and to help us understand how IBM's partnerships with other companies might relate to just like the everyday consumer too, and how we can basically just feel the impact of what IBM is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, the biggest problem that we have seen is that data is all over the place. So anybody who's trying to measure their progress or success or their baseline for where they are, where they need to go, is they're having a really challenging time, right? These data sources are in silos all across the business, all around the world. That ranges from infrastructure, their physical assets in manufacturing, across their supply chain. A lot of these things are, the data is sourced on manually on spreadsheets all across the company. And so in order to have a single system of record, it's really powerful to be able to see everything in one place. And we acquired a company in January called Invisi, and they are that single system of record for ESG data and insights and reporting, leveraging IBM's AI to pull all of that data across all those disparate data sources and then be able to analyze that, see that, pull some insights from that, and then report against that across a variety of standards that exist around the world today in ESG and sustainability. So that I think is really powerful. We found that an IBM study showed that 44%, I believe, of CEOs said that this is their biggest problem, is dealing with all the different data around their company. And more than half have said, sustainability is a top priority. So we know that we have to figure out what that delta is and support there. This is really important from a consumer perspective as well, to your point, Catherine. Consumers increasingly are putting pressure on companies to do the right thing or to make sure that what they're purchasing or how they are supporting the business is transparent. So when you think about supply chains or when you're purchasing from different companies, you want to, as a consumer, make sure that you are understanding whether or not that company is a company you want to be purchasing from. And we believe that technology and AI can help to support consumers making those appropriate decisions as well. If you think about supply chain, again, it's great that you're thinking about decarbonization and net zero, but do you want to be buying from a company that has potential, child labor or forced labor as part of their supply chain, right? My guess is probably not. So to be able to leverage technology, a single system of record, and an AI to support the core of the business operations and get a real good, transparent view into different businesses, I think it's very powerful from a consumer lens as well. And increasingly will only become, accelerated, especially as there are likely going to be increased regulations coming out, and additional consumer pressure. So I think that ties together the challenges from the data perspective, challenges from the business perspective, but what it also means from the consumer perspective.
Val, I think you can totally weigh in here because I know that city is undergoing like mapping its entire like all the emissions from the clients it works with and the businesses. So can you speak to the challenge of that? And you're trying to reach a net zero portfolio. So where do you get all this data and how do you measure progress?
I think you're exactly right. It is impossible to talk about climate and progress without really drilling into the data piece of it. At the end of the day, we're talking about measuring emissions and attributing emissions. And so what we've done at Citi is we're starting with our loan portfolio because this gets very granular, get very fast. So starting with our loan portfolio, starting with the most carbon intensive sectors, we've published most recently the emissions reduction targets for our energy and power loan portfolios. And it's exactly as described, going to public disclosures from our clients, identifying the right data sets that have emissions associated, not just with our clients, but often with the obligors, who are part of those clients, so sort of subsidiary level, and getting a real granular view of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the client, how Citi sort of attributes that to our company based on our committed loans to that client, and then rolling that up to a portfolio level. We spent a lot of time, in the early days of our net zero commitment, really trying to get that data as good as it can be, understanding where our clients are not currently publicly disclosing. That's the first point of engagement, right? If our client isn't currently disclosing their greenhouse gas emissions data, can we, through our engagement and relationship with them, encourage them to do so, which helps them, it helps us, it improves data quality, and it goes from there. I just wanted to draw a connection to the points that were made earlier around the power of the individual. We were talking about the role of the consumer. I think what we're seeing within Citi is as we are focusing on our corporate client relationships, focusing on those loan portfolios, there's a huge employee piece for us as well. We have a huge amount of employee demand and a huge amount of employee need to get the training. We're really looking at our bankers as the front line on this, the front line and engaging with our clients and figuring out their transition solutions and how we can finance them. So I think, inside the walls of Citi, there's also a tremendous amount of engagement of individuals and bankers and our senior leadership, obviously, to make sure that everyone is conversant in greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint and is prepared to help to lead the company and to engage our clients in this way.
Yeah, and Val, I just want to ask, a lot of climate activists are putting so much pressure on banks like Citi to just, hey, stop financing new fossil fuel development like natural gas. I mean, just curious, it sounds like you're taking the engagement route. Let's partner with clients, with businesses to help them with this transition. But I would just wanted to gauge your thinking, well, what Citi's approach is in light of that.
You're right. We're taking the engagement route, but it has to be partnered with commitment. So when we first made our net zero commitment, the methodology for how banks could even develop their activities under this kind of commitment is still very nascent. So we had to do the hard work with data. We had to do, the hard work of understanding what net zero, what 1.5 degree climate scenarios tell us needs to happen with regard to emissions for different sectors. And so through that work, we set ambitious climate science aligned emissions targets for our energy and power loan portfolios. So the way we look at it, when you take an ambitious climate science aligned target, you combine it with the deep relationships that we have with our clients in those sectors, then you have a really, powerful opportunity to help to engage our clients and to help to, drive that transition, drive that change. I think that engagement that we talk about, that need to help our clients transition, does need to be married up with the commitment and the ambition that you've seen in our net zero targets.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is to limit temperatures from rising 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But right now, countries are very off track. And given how slow world leaders are to act, do you think the private sector needs to aim for even more than maybe net zero? Does it have to be beyond, I guess? And Christina, maybe I'll jump to you on that one.
Yeah, thanks. I do feel really strongly that the private sector has a very strong role to play here. And in addition to that, I do think that there is a little bit of carbon tunnel visioning happening, where very, very, very ambitious and innovative and progressive thinking executives are unfortunately just kind of focused on the net zero goal. This is not to diminish how important that goal is. It's really important for all of us, and I think for the survival of the future generations. And for our businesses. But I do also think that we need to think about it more broadly. So what does that mean? We within IBM have outlined multiple commitments on our impact strategy that includes, for example, upskilling, which was just mentioned, and making sure that we are working to upskill. We said that we would commit to 30 million people globally by 2030. This is in addition to, let's say, 90% of diversion of non-hazardous waste from landfills and incinerators by 2025. This is also, let's make sure that we are thinking about our supply chain, again, as I mentioned, and making sure we're thinking about, yes, decarbonization of that, but also helping our customers and our clients thinking about the social component, the communities and the people. Climate and environment cannot be decoupled from the social piece. It cannot be decoupled from what happens to people and communities around it. And so I think that while that commitment is very important, I think people grasp onto it because it's quantitative and it's easier to measure than some of the other factors here. It's really important that we do keep in mind how all of this is all linked together and how environment affects climate, everything that's happening with climate, and our commitments there are affecting people and communities, our employees, our staff for sure, the broader business ecosystem in which we work. And I do think it's really important that we start to make sure that we are having that as part of the conversation, so that we're not just tunnel visioned around just carbon.
Yeah, Vanessa, do you want to weigh in just in terms of, the broader scope and just thinking about carbon?
From my perspective, I mean, when we talk about climate change, we're really all trying to align with science, and the science-based target initiatives is maybe the one initiative that's trying to define what does it mean to be net zero, and take the IPCC long reports and kind of make it digestible for including corporates or like users like us. And they just issued a corporate net zero standard last year, and they define kind of 4 key requirements. And I think this is what we'll all have to kind of really think about. Focus on rapid and deep emissions cut. I think the most important is what are companies and milestone in 2025, 2030, because 2050, none of current executives will be in their role. So set near, medium, and long-term targets. And one thing that I find that was even surprising to me is that no company should make net zero claim until long targets are met. And also, there's no net zero really for a company that matters. It's at the planetary level that it matters. So it all has to stack up. It's a simple equation. And so back to your point of like, should corporates do more? Well, yes, maybe, because it's a balance. We all have to reduce and then remove to get to net zero. And so if someone is not reducing enough, then someone else has to remove more. Or so it's obviously that balance is very tricky at a planetary level. But that's also why they included a fourth requirement, which is go beyond the value chain. And I think that what you just talked about, Christina, is maybe part of that. It's like, what can you do beyond the carbon view to make sure that your impact and your actions are having additional value beyond the value chain or beyond like your whole own ecosystem that you can kind of manage. So that's kind of how I think also about the additional impact we can all have. But this is really hard to kind of really make sure we use the vocabulary and then we keep track on these action on these deep emissions reduction that have to come before 2030 to be on a 1.5 degree scenario pathway. So that's, I'm going to refrain from saying net zero basically until we've all become net zero.
Yeah, well, I just want to jump in here too, because I think one debate in this race for net zero, maybe we shouldn't use that right now, but it's like the use of carbon offsets to achieve goals, and which basically means like a company will purchase like a credit, they'll buy it for a ton of a carbon that has been reduced elsewhere, maybe through a renewable energy project or protecting a forest or planting trees. But I think this is controversial because maybe there's not enough transparency about like how good the credits are, if there's good quality, if that carbon's going to be stored for generations. And Vanessa, I understand Schneider does purchase them, so I just hoping you can explain, the rationale and if it's what the future is that way.
That's a great question. So for a net zero by 2050, there's very limited offsets, and they have to be of the highest quality and likely kind of removal per the science again. So what is the role of carbon offsets in that transition? That's really kind of the question. I think they will play a role, particularly in that transition, but we're very clear that they have to be kind of the last resort, and that the first efforts we all have to focus on is reduction of emissions. But then there's different type of, even the vocabulary around carbon offsets is very uncertain, very blurry, as you said. There's a lack of transparency in the market, but there's also kind of a bit of a lack of precision in the use of wordings. We put a lot of different things into carbon offsets, and even, renewable energy credits, for example, sometimes are qualified as offsets, so I think it's really kind of becoming clearer, and going back to one point that was made, being transparent about what is used and why it's used. But in that transition phase, we definitely understand that it's going to be hard for us to get to the level of emissions reduction to net zero until some of the technologies that we're investing in will help us kind of make the harder reductions that we're not tackling already. But we're all focusing on, what's called still the low-hanging fruits: energy efficiency, renewable energy, adding more circularity, starting to look at low-carbon materials. But if you want to kind of fully decarbonize our value chain, it's true that we don't have a full roadmap without carbon offsets in some capacity in the next 10 years or maybe 2 decades. But we all know where the destination is, and the destination is very, very limited offsets to be able to meet that equation at the planetary level of net zero. That's 10 to 15% according to science.
Val, I just want to jump to you. What is cities thinking on, and are carbon offsets part of your plan?
Well, I agree that there is a broad range of what we would call carbon credits or carbon offsets. With regard to cities' plan, the targets that we've set out for 2030 are really focused on reducing emissions associated with our clients and our loan portfolio. As was mentioned, I think that all of our jobs right now is reduce, reduce, reduce. And I think that in the world of removal offsets, the types of offsets that are actually removing greenhouse gas emissions, carbon from the atmosphere, I think there's still a lot to be discovered in that area. And I wanted to just touch on, a comment that Christina made earlier around the importance of a number of other environmental and social issues that really live alongside climate. And I think when you look at removal offsets, a portion of which will be most likely necessary for true net zero in 2050, some of the nature-based and biodiversity-based removal offsets, the offsets that, if well-defined, if certified, if, deemed credible, I think could make a big difference, both in terms of nearer-term removal of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere, but also in protecting nature and biodiversity. So I think that's a market that is really in its earliest stages, but I think would be exciting to see further develop, and there'd be a lot of co-benefits along with that.
Christina, do you want to jump in with IBM?
Sure. Yeah, IBM, we've explicitly said we do not do offsets. To what the other two have mentioned, we are focused 100% on reductions. And so we've explicitly stated in our commitments that we will not do offsets or renewable credits. So I think that is really a huge part of how we are focused in our commitments and our determination to get to carbon neutral status. And because I think there are a lot of question marks around what the market is like and how to make sure that we are defining this in the appropriate way, we decided that we would stay away from that completely and altogether.
Okay, gotcha. So I want to shift a little bit more to, what you're doing on the education piece of the workforce, for example, because, you guys won't be in your positions, forever. There's going to be a next generation of leaders at the companies that you're working at. So I just want to, understand what skills you're looking for when you're hiring, and also what's so important to go beyond your current ambitions, the important things that people know. So here, maybe I'll let Val start.
Sure, happy to. Well, I've been in the sustainability field now for 25 years. My entire career has been in this space. And when I started, it was, I think, a more unique skill set, a more unique academic area as well. And now, I mean, the generations that are now, coming into our workplaces, the newer employees, this has been part of their curriculum. You don't have to go to school and major in environmental science, for example, to understand how sustainability interrelates with the economy, interrelates with people, interrelates with the environment. It is just embedded in their curriculum. And so I think, when I think about our employees, I know that our newest crop of employees coming into Citi they already understand sustainability. They already understand the, potentially severe economic impacts of climate change, and they're equipped with a lot of those tools. So what we have been doing is, as I mentioned earlier, beginning to think about how do we ensure that our current employees, the most senior employees as well, also have a pretty high level of knowledge so that they can do that direct engagement with clients and help to bring about that reduction in emissions that we're talking about. I think when you look ahead and you look at the younger generations, the amount of sort of, climate and sustainability IQ they're already bringing to the workplace. You combine that with some of the new technologies that we see coming online to meet the energy demands of the future. That really does give you hope that from a people perspective as well as a technology perspective, we're going to see a lot of change ahead.
And Vanessa, what about Schneider? Are you guys looking for particular expertise, or are you looking to train current employees? What are you working on?
Yeah, employee talent is really at the core of what we're doing. I mean, we're selling sustainability, and so being able to hire sustainability talent and elevate sustainability in every role really at Schneider. And this goes to very operational roles. And also to our network, to our ecosystem. Obviously, we sell, as I've said, a lot of digital and hardware, like electric equipment that are here to decarbonize and electrify the grid. But that means we're dealing with, through networks of distributors, we're dealing with electricians, and so being able to empower all of the workforce, really, from And we talked earlier about buildings. So being able to engage with architects, with constructors, with building companies, that's like all part of the ecosystem that we're in fact really thinking about. How do we reach out? How do we make them aware of the lower carbon solutions that we have so that we can really enact? Because at the end of the day, if we don't connect between the strategy and what happens on the ground, well, we already need to accelerate, but we'll have to accelerate even further. So, and we see that, as you said, I think, Val, it's going to be an expectation that younger generation wants a company with purpose and a sustainable company. We're seeing already example in Europe, and particularly in France, of students during their graduation refusing, like making statement, refusing to work for companies or sectors that are contributing to climate change. And this is a given that sustainability has to be part of younger generation role. But for all of the work in the existing workforce is really empowering them to be able to embrace the same. And so we developed a sustainability school at Schneider in partnership with AXA that has launched a climate school, and it's a lot of training, a lot of ongoing work there to educate and elevate.
Mm-hmm. And our IBM, Christina, are you guys just same question, like what skills are you looking for, and what kind of investments are you making now to make sure that that next generation has the skills you're looking for?
Yeah, so we similarly are making sure that focused on our employees currently as well as the next generation. So making sure that we have new curriculums and online education courses that we're investing in across the company to make sure that everybody can speak to this and everybody's aware of how important this is as part of their job. I think one of the main points that I also want to mention though is, we don't necessarily have to hire somebody that's a sustainability expert. Maybe that is needed for certain roles, but I also think that part of our mantra around this is that everybody can come into this and support the sustainability imperative, right? So no matter what function you have at your disposal, whatever you're an expert in, if you think about it from the facet or from the lens on a sustainability angle, you are supporting the cause, right? So you don't have to necessarily be an expert in the standards or an expert in climate science. There are many ways that you can support what we need to be doing from a sustainability software perspective in my business, or sustainability writ large to create a sustainable company for future generations to want to work at, regardless of what your background is. So that's one thing I wanted to make sure that I pointed out. The second is also, though, that I think it's really important, at least for us, one of our major global priorities is around the 30 million skilling initiative that we have by 2030. As part of that, that's a huge investment that we're putting in globally. We're working with high schools, technical schools, early professionals across. They're not necessarily people that have to have certain degrees, but enabling, as was mentioned before, the technology platform to really accelerate how people can be learning about sustainability, but also, again, focusing on functional skills that can be leveraged for sustainability initiatives and goals. It's just to make them relevant, make sure that they have the right relevant skill sets for this next generation of workers that we are pulling into our companies. And I think that is, it's really powerful, and it's going to be the way that we are hopefully empowered to make the change that's needed for the next generations to come.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you could share a story about some sort of failure that you learned from in the company's sustainability journey. At each of your companies, like you've been in your positions for, I don't know exactly how long, but I'm sure, there's been some failures, some success stories, and maybe it'd be really helpful for people listening to know what those were and how you learned from them. And then, maybe it put you on a new path at Citi, for example. Val, do you want to jump in?
Sure, happy to. Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, there's a lot of this is about timing, right? And there have been, I'm gonna answer this question two different ways. There have been, commitments that my team felt like we were ready to make that, was not sort of where the company needed to head, right? And so you're sort of watching for the right opportunity to move forward on a new initiative, the right opportunity to, move forward on a new commitment, and sort of watching that landscape. And I've been at Citi for quite a while, and so I have come to appreciate just the value of timing. I think it's fair to say, if you look back, there have been, specific sort of, say, transactions that we didn't fully anticipate what some of the, controversies might have been.
Can you point to a specific example? That would be helpful.
Well, I probably shouldn't point to specific examples. And look, we finance the global economy, and you're always sort of assessing the landscape and trying to understand, what the benefits are, what potential risks are, and trying to calibrate those. And so I think, what we do is, if we find out that we haven't appropriately calibrated, we immediately start to look at, how do we learn lessons from that? How do we tap, for example, relationships that we have in the stakeholder community? How do we tap relationships that we have in our investor community, so that we can learn fast and do quick course corrections? And what I think has been most heartening is when we are able to develop those learnings and we see our clients pick those up and run with it. To give you an example, there have been instances where we've realized that, it's time for the financial community to sort of take the next step on human rights. We see clients out there in the field, understanding what those lessons learned are, taking them inside their own companies, and doing their own gap analysis. And I think that's really, here we're talking about systemic change, right? We're talking about systemic change with regard to climate. We're talking about systemic change with regard to learning those lessons more quickly. And without going into specifics, I think, any mistake, any miscalibration we make has to be followed by not just learning within our own organizations, but how do we help to ensure that that learning is happening across our value chains? We're all rowing in the right direction, but the world is moving so quickly now.
Christina, I'll turn to you. Any, failures that you've gone through that you learned from it that would, led to a course correction, I guess, at IBM?
Yeah, I don't know how to call it a failure necessarily, but I would use the word definition. So I think everybody in this space recognizes that people are defining sustainability or ESG or whatever it is that you want to use as the moniker of the day in a different way. And what that means to the company can also be construed in a different way. So we have lots of people at IBM who are super passionate about the topic. And it's a real pleasure to be working with other people who are super passionate about the topic. But in different ways, there may be ways that we define sustainability or what that means to the business in not necessarily conflicting ways, but ways where there might be some tension. And so for every kind of 2 steps or 3 steps forward, there may be 1, 2, 3, or 4 steps back. And it does frustrate, I think, people who, again, are passionate about the topic, want to make sure that we're doing this and moving the needle and creating scale and impact in a way that really enforces change, where we are a change maker in the space of sustainability, in technology, etc. But I think because there are so few standards out there, because this is such an evolving space, and because people are so oftentimes emotional about some of the different topics that come up around climate, around human rights, around refugees, around social justice, all of these different topics, I think it makes it oftentimes difficult to make sure that you are aligned on the same page and then moving in lockstep in the same direction in order to make sure that you're augmenting that scale and impact. So it's not necessarily one failure, Catherine, but I do think that it's just making sure that there's really strong alignment and getting that baseline and making sure that everybody who's working in this space is really, again, focused and driving towards in the same vectors, in the same direction, and moving the needle together. Otherwise, I think there can be ways where you see, I think failure is too strong of a word, but you see maybe some setbacks and some drawbacks happening from the company's perspective.
And Vanessa, I'll let you end.
I think, like Christina and Val, I mean, sustainability has been a journey for a lot of us. We've been in that space for quite a lot. And the way you define sustainability 10, 15 years ago, even, go back further, is very different than how it is today. I used to call it the 50 shades of green. And like every year you're trying to get to the darker, darker, darker kind of forest green. But some of us, and including in my different roles in different companies, we may have started for certain topics in the lightest green, and that's kind of it's not necessarily an error, but it's more like you have to try, you have to test it, and then you can kind of go to the next step. Unfortunately, because of climate change accelerating, or the pace of inaction to date, we have to kind of skip the steps or make sure that the next one that are coming in are getting the benefit of our lessons learned. And so I think this is really where sustainability is this great world where we have to share. We have to share our failure. We have to share our lessons learned. We have to share, okay, this is where I started, but now I would start from this endpoint. And then, climate change, because it really touches, as we said, all of the social, economic, like everything. It's figuring out the complexity of the impact, and really understanding that impact is still tricky. And we see every day, like when we make decision on greening our freight, what will be the impact on supply chain, or what would be and having an understanding of all of the consequences and all of the ripple effect is, I would say, that we're still learning every day, because it really relates to kind of the data or the modelization that we have access to, and there's lessons to learn every day there, but it's not necessarily an error, or it's more like learning every day to adjust and adapt to also a world that is not only changing on climate, but on a number of other things, including supply chains, for example.
Mhm. Great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have. So I just like to thank you all, Vanessa, Val, Christina, for your insights, and also to our presenting partner, which is Schneider Electric. I think if I've learned anything from this conversation today, is that companies are figuring it out, trying to do the right thing, and focusing on actually reducing their emissions, while at the same time investing in their current workforce, a fancy term they call upskilling, which I think just means, training their current employees and also making sure future generations have the skills required to get to these net zero goals that they've set. We're going to continue to cover these topics at Insider, so please be sure to follow us and engage on social media using the hashtag Insider Events, and check out our article series, Making Net Zero Possible. And in a few moments, our survey will pop up on your screen. We'd love to get your feedback. That way we can keep improving. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.